We are very fortunate to have Peter Trull here for Cape Cod Once Around the Sun, an absolutely stunning book.
Thank you.
And enjoy.
Hi, so thanks for coming. This is great. I always love to do programs, whether it's for lots of people or 8 or 10 people. I'm happy that you're here. I've been on the Cape since the early 70s, spent 10 years with Massachusetts Audubon Society, working as the director of their coastal seabird program, which means basically that I monitored about 10 or 12 nesting colonies of terns and piping plovers all through the 70s and 80s. And while I was working for Mass Audubon, I'm going to just do a little bit of a background, if you don't mind, before we start this. While I was working for Mass Audubon, we would put bans on common and roseate tern chicks. Roseate terns are federally endangered species. And there were about 12 nesting colonies from Plymouth Beach all the way out to Chatham and Monomoy and Eastham. We started to get numbers of bans written on white-lined paper. And when I ask people, when have you ever found a bird with a band on its leg? Most people say, well, never. I've never seen a banded bird. But we were getting lists of band numbers from South America. And of course, that raised our curiosity. Where were these people getting bands from terns in South America? And we learned that the bands were coming from an area in a country called Guyana, which was British Guiana, became an independent nation as Guyana. And we learned that the people in this country eat birds and fish. About 90% of the people live on 4% of the land, which is the coastline, which is the northern coast of South America. There's French Guiana, Dutch Guiana, and British Guiana. Dutch Guiana is now Suriname. British Guiana is now Guyana. So I went to Guyana to investigate, not to tell people not to do this. This is what they eat. This is their culture. And we found that in several villages, there were men and boys who trapped birds, migratory birds, all day and at night. So they were not only trapping and eating common terns that we protect all throughout Eastern North America, but all of the Arctic sandpipers and plovers that nest throughout the high Arctic, which was kind of mind-blowing because I ended up eating all of the birds in the field guide, all of the sandpipers, the terns. But when I arrived back in the States, I did 2 research trips, one in 80 and one in 83. The Mass Beach Buggy Association and other off-road vehicle clubs were lobbying and picketing at the National Seashore and other town offices, arguing, why are we closing the beaches to protect piping plovers when they're just going to South America to be eaten? And you could still hear that on talk radio every year. They sing the same song. But what I had to explain, and what I've been explaining for 30 years, is that piping plovers don't migrate past the Gulf Coast. So all the piping plovers that breed in northeastern North America spend the winter in Georgia, Alabama, Florida, Mississippi, maybe Virgin Islands, but none of them go to South America. But the list of plovers, there's black-bellied plovers, which are on the menu, and semi-palmated plovers, all of the sandpipers. And that was a very interesting part of my life. I worked with the Museum of Natural History for quite a long time in Brewster and started researching eastern coyotes. So the other program on this card is my lecture on eastern coyotes, which is an animal that needs to be taught about because there are so many misconceptions about eastern coyotes. The fear mongering that goes on about this wild canid is frightening, the way people talk about them and worry about their children and their pets. And eastern coyotes are just another wild animal. You let your small dog off the leash, it's going to chase coyote because all of the small dogs, and I'm not a coyote defender at all. I get all my DNA samples from hunters and roadkills, but what people don't seem to want to grasp is that this plague wiped out most of the population of Europe in the 1600s, and all of the small dogs from Europe were bred to chase rats and kill rats. West Highland Terrier, the Jack Russell Terrier, the Poodle, the Dachshund, the Beagle, all small terriers, so that when people let their small dogs out of the house today on a leash, not on a leash, I interviewed at least 30 people from East Ham and Wellfleet, New Orleans, and Brewster who lost their dogs. And all of them said, well, I let her out to do her business. But if any of those dogs sees a fox or a coyote or any round four-legged quadruped, it's going to chase it. And what always happens is the coyote, eastern coyote, does not want to get bit. So it turns around, shakes the dog, and walks away. So I've done a lot of work with coyotes. I wrote a small book called Coyotes in the Neighborhood. When I worked at the Museum of Natural History, there was a wonderful man, one of the founders of the Museum of Natural History, actually a fellow called John Hay, who's a great writer, he is considered one of America's great. Hi, welcome. Thank you for coming. You don't have to be sorry. It's quite all right. I'm just doing a brief introduction. John Hay was one of the founders of the Cape Cod Museum of Natural History, and he wrote many, many books. He's considered today to be one of America's great nature writers. He passed away several years ago, but I was lucky enough to know him. He wrote 2 books about terns in his life, which was the bird I studied, both again here and in South America. And I really loved the man. He would call me up on the phone and he would say, he was quite a bit older than I was. He would say, can I ride with you in your truck and watch the terns with you? And I was honored that he would even ask me. So we'd ride around. He was very ethereal. I'm in my 20s and early 30s, and here's this gentleman sitting beside me talking about poetic virtue of terns and seabirds. And I'm just kind of going, But it turned out that as we got older, we became very close friends. In 1961, he wrote a book called Nature's Year, one of his many books. And he chronicled the seasons on Cape Cod, talked about everything from forests to lightning bugs to birds. And I loved the book. And as I got older, and I had written several books on whales, or worked at the Center for Coastal Studies for a long time, I wrote a great book called Closer to the Great Whales. But I wanted to pay tribute to John somehow. And when I was teaching at the Cape Cod Lighthouse Charter School, I retired about 4 years ago, I taught a seminar with a woman called Susanna Remillard. She lives in Dennis. And we taught a seminar about John Hay for the kids, the 7th graders. And John Hay's home was in Brewster, and his writing cabin was in the woods. And we took the kids there, and we would open several of John's books in his library. His house was open. It's now the headquarters for all of the conservation groups on the Cape, his houses. And we would open his books for the kids and have them read and have them interpret. What do you think John's saying in this sentence? So the kids would write their own thoughts. And Susanna and I started thinking about a book. And of course, she was very busy. She got a Fulbright. She went to New Zealand. And she said, Trull, you write the book. So I decided to do that. I decided to write a book. And I wanted to make it tribute to John and his book, Nature's Year. So I called it Cape Cod Once Around the Sun. And my deadline, my original manuscript, was due in 2019, actually the end of 2019. And when I submitted it, the photo editors and the editors at Schiffer Publishing said, you don't like this that much, Peter. There's a lot of old photographs here. And I said, well, I did rather go into the archives. I looked at all of my photographs and I picked out the ones I liked. And they said, yeah, but we can tell that some of these photographs that you submitted for your book are from a Kodachrome slide that was made into CD that was put on your computer. And they said, we can just tell. And they said, so we're going to reject 40% of the photographs. So of course, I was all flustered, and mad. I'm saying, these are beautiful photographs. And they said, look, this is what we'll do. They said, we'll start on January 1st, 2021. And you can go right through the year. And you can choose your shots and follow the seasons. You can use a tripod and you can make beautiful digital photographs for 1 year. January 1st, December 31st will be your deadline. So I thought that was a good idea. So I said, okay, let's do that. So this is the result of that. 1 year, week by week, of carefully produced photographs. I don't think a lot of these, almost any of these are from the hip. They're all photographs that I planned because I had the time. I knew that if it was the second week in March, I could go out and photograph spotted salamanders emerging from their winter hibernation. I knew that if it was late August, I could go and photograph shorebirds migrating from the high Arctic. I knew that if it was mid-July, I could photograph beach plants. So I did that right through the year. So I'm going to show you a number of photographs now. I really like it when people ask questions when they see a photograph. And I'm not supposed to do that with this technology. But if you just can't help it, but otherwise, wait until the end of the program if you can think of it. And you can say, well, back when you showed the picture of the 80s slipper in May, let's do that. But I do like to teach a lot. I like to talk a lot about photographs. To me, the cliche of a photograph being worth 1,000 words is absolutely true. There's so much to learn just from one photograph. My original photograph I thought was a piece of beach grass being blown by the wind in a perfect circle. I thought that was perfect for Once Around the Sun. No such luck, said the editors. They want a Cape Cod beach. So that's what we got on the cover. So we'll work our way. Generally, in my book, I begin in May because it was suggested to me by my mentor, who was my guru, really my teacher when I worked for 10 years studying terns. He said, why don't you start with May and June? That's the time of rebirth, time of rejuvenation. So the book starts May and June, but I like to begin in the winter because we've all been here. We've all lived through the year of Cape Cod. We've all been once around the sun many times. We know that the beaches in the winter are cold and desolate, but still beautiful. Sand doesn't always have snow covering. When we go to any outer beach from Provincetown to Mashpee, we can find a deep blue ocean, beautiful clouded sky. Beach grass lost all its capacity to photosynthesize. It turns brown, and the contrast with the snow is a beautiful sight. And of course, we get a lot of visitors during the winter months. Hi, thanks. Nice to see you. And of course, all of the birds that we see here in the winter, or at least a good number of them, especially on the water, are all birds from the far north. There are 3 types of scoters. This one is called the white-winged scoter. And it spends the winter here. It arrives here in the late December and into January. And you can go to almost any beach on Cape Cod in the winter and see these beautiful white-winged scoters. They're diving ducks. They dive beneath the surface for their food. They probably spend more time underwater than they do swimming. This one just splashed to the surface after diving. They eat mollusks, mussels, crabs. They spend a lot of time on the outer Cape. This is Provincetown, Race Point, on a typical winter day, cold and crisp, low clouds, lots of birds, gulls and gannets soaring over the water because there's always food to be had as the tide churns up the bottom. Here's a little sandpiper called a dunlin. Now this dunlin is a winter sandpiper. You can see it's walking on snow. We don't always think of, bless you, we don't always think of sandpipers as walking on snow. And yet this bird, this tiny little dunlin, about as big as a sparrow, maybe a little bit bigger, spends its breeding season as far north on Earth's land as it possibly can. It's literally on the top of the planet. It's found on every continent in the world because when it migrates south, no matter which way it flies, it's south, literally on top of the earth. The female often lays 2 clutches of eggs. Conditions are so hostile that this tiny sandpiper sits on eggs that the male will incubate 1 clutch of eggs and the female will incubate another, hoping to raise young. And of course, the eggs hatch and they do well. But this is a bird on Cape Cod that you'll only see in the coldest months of the year. And the same is true of this sanderling. I don't know if you can see the ice here, but this bird is taking a bath in the ice water in January. right into February. This is the bird that runs up and down the beach ahead of, chases the waves. It's a sandling. A lot of people think all the sandpipers do that, but they don't. Only the sandling on the outer beach runs up ahead of the wave, feeds, runs back down. So when you're at the beach this winter and you see that happening, it's going to be a very small, very whitish sandpiper. And you can say, oh, look at the sandling. And your friend will say, how do you know that's the sandling? And you'll go, oh, I know by this behavior. They'll be very impressed. Sandlings chase the waves up and down. This is another high Arctic bird. So the peregrine falcon is a winter falcon, the bird-eating falcon. This one was on Race Point. They patrol the beaches all winter long. And for those of you that have never seen sanderlings or dunlins or peregrines, need to get out more because all of these birds are here all winter long, despite the weather. This is Cape Cod Bay and a good snow squall. One of my favorite spots to photograph. It's the Seward Harbor in Dennis. I did quite a bit of work over here with Sampson's Dead Neck Island, and there were herons and terns and plovers nesting there. But winter is a time when most people pretty much stay inside. We have geese that migrate from the high Arctic, and this brant, smaller than a Canada goose. Some people might look at this and think it's a Canada goose because it has white on the neck. It doesn't have the cheek patch and it has a little white patch on its neck. But this bird is completely happy walking along the snow-covered shore, freezing cold, snow piling up on its back. And in this case, it's eating sea lettuce, which is a very common algae that washes up on the beaches. Now, this is when you should be asking questions, right? Some of you might be sitting there going, what about this? What about that? The scoter, the white-winged scoter. Good question. You would have never remembered that. They swallow them whole. You have a very powerful gizzard. The gizzard breaks up the shell. They digest the organism inside the shell. And if you're on the bottom of the ocean in the winter, all this blue snow is coming down from the mussel, the blue mussel that was crushed in its gizzard. No, they swallow the mussels whole. All of the eiders, especially if you were to see the beak of a common eider, it's very big and powerful. In fact, most of these scoters have very strong beaks with good muscles in their face. This is a very typical winter visitor, snowy owl. We see them in years, primarily when there is what we call an intrusion of snowy owls. And it occurs periodically. We never know when it will occur, but on some winters we might find snowy owls over the entire Cape. Sandy Neck, Dead Neck, South Cape Beach, Nauset, Monomoy, Provincetown, and then other years, you just can't find them. And of course, it has to do with climate of their breeding ground, which is the Arctic tundra. And these also have a circumpolar distribution. You can find them in Alaska, Canada, Norway, Siberia, northern Russia, all the way around the planet. And depending on what their food situation is, it depends on how far south they will migrate. It also depends a little bit on snow cover, but they're not going to be discouraged from eating in snow cover because they can actually hear mice under the snow. So these birds will fly above the snow, hear a mouse under the snow in the grass, and plunge their feet down through the snow to catch the mouse. And this typically would be a young owl where it's as black as it is, hasn't acquired its completely white plumage yet. Females are also barred black and white. And it is difficult to tell sometimes the difference between a female snowy owl and an immature. The amount of black on this one tells me that it's probably a bird of the year. So this bird probably hatched out of an egg in June on the Arctic tundra. It's flown south to the shores of Cape Cod for the winter. And they feed on anything they want. They feed on ducks, they feed on mice, they feed on rabbits. They eat all kinds of birds if they can catch them. They're voracious and very powerful predators. They even take great blue herons and Canada geese. And they basically break their neck, they just fly into them with their talons and break their neck and then feed on them. But they are big duck eaters. You have a question? What? They are cute, but they're not cute if you're a duck. It's easy for them to be cute if you're human. You know, white-tailed deer probably think they're cute, but but small mammals and birds don't. Yeah, they terrorize the beaches, just like the peregrine falcon that I showed earlier. So here we are now. It's probably getting to be January, late January. We can see the seed heads on the beach grass. The beach grass is called Ammophila, common name dune grass, beach grass, but the genus name is Ammophila. And each of these tufts at the top of the grass stem are a grass seed. And if you were to take any of the grass seeds in the winter on any of the beaches on the Cape and break up that tuft at the top, you'd have it just like you went to Agway and bought grass seed. It is a true grass, it's pure grass, and it plants itself, although they are growing on a rhizome. Are you familiar with a rhizome? Underground root system. It's rather like Christmas lights buried underground. From each bulb would come plants. So this is a prolific species that literally holds our dunes together. But it does attract some northern visitors. In this case, a snow bunting. You'll only see a snow bunting on Cape Cod between November and February, because they too nest in the high Arctic. They lose their beautiful contrasting black and white plumage into this sort of nondescript, winter plumage. It doesn't want to cooperate, but that's okay. We'll try again. You're being very nice to me. Okay, sorry about this. Snow bunting. So the snow starts to melt by the time we get to February. As February wanes, we find wintergreen growing all throughout the forests, the woods of Cape Cod. That is moss underneath it, wintergreen berry, and of course the wintergreen berries are great food for birds. You can see that the oak leaves are fallen, they're on the forest floor, they're all brown. Things are starting to warm up by February. Full moon is always beautiful against the bare branches. Sky turns a different color. We get different amount of photo period. And of course, so much of nature is dependent on photo period. That is literally the amount of daylight. The amount of daylight every day influences hormones in wild animals. It influences gonadal changes in wild animals. It influences buds on trees. Day length is a huge factor in how our planet affects the living things that grow. And of course, people are getting ready in April because cottages are closed. They bring out the heavy equipment, shore up land in front of their cottages. I don't even know if this dune is even still there from 2 years ago because the Cape is eroding so fast. Any of you that have been following what's happening down in Chatham, my goodness, Morris Island is washing away. Fish and Wildlife headquarters have been torn down. Gosh, when we were working on the turn program and we would take the boat out to Monomoy, we'd go down the 60 or 70 stairs, take the boats that are moored, come up the stairs, go across the parking lot, enter the big Fish and Wildlife headquarters. All of that's gone, washed away. We are slowly losing the outer Cape because of sea level change, warming climates. So it's late February when the red-winged blackbirds arrive. This is one of the harbingers of spring. Everybody waits for red-winged blackbirds to hear their call in the marsh. Crocuses start to bloom. We're all starting to think that, well, maybe backbone of winter is broken. The ice on the pond is melted down now to just a few pieces of morning ice, cold morning ice around the freshwater emergent vegetation. We know it's getting to be spring, and late February and early March arrive. And salamanders lay their eggs. On the first rainy night after the March full moon, if none of you have ever experienced this, this typically happens in all of the abandoned bogs on the Cape. Spotted salamanders live underground. They're called mole salamanders. Their whole life, they live underground in chipmunk burrows dug into the sand, in field mouse burrows dug into the sand. Any old coyote den that's under the root of a tree, they're dug into the sand. But after the first full moon in March, when it rains, spotted salamanders just emerge by the thousands. They go into all these small ditches and vernal pools, and they lay their eggs in large gelatinous masses. And you can go out on rainy nights in March, and they're everywhere. And you say, well, I've never really seen one. Well, I lifted up a board once and I saw one. On the first rainy night in March, after the March full moon, they are all over the ground. There are people who drive the roads looking for spring peepers and spotted salamanders, and they're just crossing the roads, going to their favorite breeding ground. They come back to the same breeding site every year. I often do walks with people, Harvard's Conservation Trust or Brewster Conservation Trust. We wait for a rainy night after the March full moon, and people can't believe what they see. Look into the water and see these swirling masses of black and orange, males and females mating and choosing mates, swirling around in the water. It's phenomenal, and most people have never seen it. But it happens every March. And out come the spring peepers. That chorus we're so familiar with. These tiny frogs are about the size of a cranberry. We hear them by the tens of thousands. Mid-March, typically a little bit later in March, right the way through May. And all they're doing is sitting there. The males are singing, the females are coming on. They breed, they lay eggs, and they're gone again. Where do they go? Where are these spring peepers now? In the treetops. They're tree frogs. So I've heard them every month of the year. Sitting there, you're going out to your car in the morning and you hear the single peep, peep, peep coming from the woods. Tiny little frog on a warm January day. They're tree frogs. They live in the oaks, way up high. Well, the daffodils are out. It's late March and early April, but there's still snow on the ground. We need a real harbinger of spring. And that would be the piping plover. During the third week of March, they usually arrive. They arrive in the same area that they nested and bred the year before. It's a trait called site tenacity, and it's true with all species of birds. And site tenacity simply dictates this. If you lay eggs and you raise young and they survive to fledge and late summer comes and the family flies away, that's a good spot. And you come right back there the next year. If you have a vista or any kind of a shrub in your yard, and you've got a catbird nesting in it, and that catbird raises 3 or 4 babies, and they all fledge, and you see the babies in your yard, and that catbird flies all the way to Central America. If it raised young, it's going to come back to that same shrub in your yard. When I was working on the churn program, I was at Plymouth Beach with Dr. Nisbet. We saw an Arctic tern sitting on 2 eggs, had a band on its leg. We said, let's catch that bird, see how old it is, find out who banded it. Arctic terns were rare in Massachusetts at the time. So we used a very technical method of trapping it. box, stick, string. Put the box over the 2 eggs, got in the truck. Adult came back, banned the box, looked at the eggs, and of course the drive to incubate is so strong. Caught the bird, found out that it was 22 years old, was banded on Tern Island in Chatham sometime in the early 60s. We released the bird, and we know through banding recoveries and through records that that Arctic tern, when it migrated south, when it left Cape Cod in August, September, it migrated east across the North Atlantic, probably flew down past Gibraltar, the west coast of Africa, flew across the southern Atlantic Ocean to the eastern shore of Argentina, wintered on the Antarctic ice pack. Every Arctic tern does this. So do those sanderlings and dunlins that I showed you. So this bird wintered on the Antarctic ice pack, returned, and the next year at Plymouth Beach, we trapped that same Arctic tern less than 20 inches from where we had trapped it the year before, incubating 2 eggs. So if there was ever an example of site tenacity, that was it. That bird raised 2 chicks, wintered in South America, came back and nested this far from where we had trapped it the year before on Plymouth Beach. Same spot. And this is a trait of birds that it's only one of so many phenomenal traits of birds that we often don't understand, don't get to read about, don't get taught about. Piping plovers are exactly this. They come right back to the same beach year after year after year. If they lose their nest, find a better spot. You have a question? They winter along the Gulf Coast. I don't know if you got here a little bit late, but I was talking about my work in South America. And after I got back from studying market trapping in South America, I lived with all these trappers who they trap and eat birds in Guyana. Did you hear me say this? Okay. So I did research in Guyana, South America, where people trap and eat birds. And when I got back, there used to be a bumper sticker. You don't see it much anymore, but there used to be a bumper sticker that said, "Piping plovers taste like chicken." You ever see that? And that was all because of my research, because all these mass beach buggy associations and groups were angry that I was, eating birds with market trappers in South America, studying the methods that these trappers use to catch all the birds here in North America. But the fact is, piping plovers actually don't fly past the Gulf Coast. So the piping plovers that are nesting on Cape Cod are wintering in Florida, the Bahamas, Louisiana, even as far as Texas, but they don't go any further. Whereas the hummingbird that's at your hummingbird feeder flies all the way across the Gulf of Mexico to Central and South America. So piping plovers, that's why they arrive here in late March. They don't have a long way to fly. So they start nesting by early April, and pretty soon the beaches, which are still closed, should be opened up to vehicles because they'll be finished. Good.
If they're not successful in their nesting, they won't come back to that spot.
They'll come probably back to the beach, but they'll find a better spot, a safer spot. It may be higher above the high tide line. A lot of early nesting, young, inexperienced birds get washed out by the high tide. They go, "Oh, this looks great. Look there's nobody here. There's no vegetation. There's no other birds. Let's lay our legs right here." And then you get the spring high tide. And so this is a glossy ibis. This is an April arrival. We're into mid-April, and the glossy ibis is one of the waders. It's actually a type of heron, but we can find them at places like Bell's Neck Conservation Area. We can find them on Sandy Neck, but they don't nest here. They're just moving through, but they're a phenomenal bird to see when you're out birding in the spring. A lot of people are not aware that bluebirds arrive and begin nesting very early. They have eggs as early as mid-April. In the box, this very box, in fact, that I monitor every year, these bluebirds raise 2 clutches of chicks, 2 broods of chicks this summer. They're done. A lot of people don't like it when I mention mid-August or late July and say, "Oh, what a beautiful early autumn day." But in the world of nature, summer's over. I can tell you that right now. I mean, the goldenrod is starting to bloom. All the birds are finished nesting. Nesting season is done. So all the birds right now in your yard are fattening up for migration. And in fact, you could probably go to any of the beaches along Nantucket Sound and see least sandpipers or sanderling or semi-palmated sandpipers that nested on the Arctic tundra and are already on their way to Argentina. And they'll stay right through August into September, and they'll migrate. They'll be gone by mid-October. But mid-July and early August is when the first shorebirds arrive here on their southern migration from the high Arctic. Bluebirds are beautiful. They're common. If you don't have them in your yard in the winter, go to Stop and Shop and get some beef suet and put it in one of those little beef suet cages. They don't respond so much to those processed cakes that you can buy for $2.50 everywhere. But if you go to the beef department at the supermarket and get the pure white suet, you'll get bluebirds. They love it. They come right into it. And they tell their friends about it. They do. They come right into beef suet in the winter. And they don't hit that processed stuff very much. No, my goodness. You know, you'll even have wintering pine warblers that will come into pure beef suet. Birds are picky. You know, I bet everybody sitting here and me, you know, we choose what we want to eat, right? You won't catch me eating pesto. So if I'm a bird and somebody's got pesto outside their house, they're not going to see me out their window. But, you know, if they put something else out there that's good, I might come right in. And that's absolutely the truth with birds. Birds choose their food. That's why sunflowers, black oil sunflower is so good as a bird food, because it's protein rich, it's fat rich, everybody likes it. So, you know, black oil sunflower is your go-to bird food for the winter. You have a question? First butterflies arrive in April, mid to late April. The reptiles emerge from hibernation. This is a black racer, very common, harmless mouse-eating snake, widespread on the Cape, one of our biggest snakes. It grows to be about 4 or 5 feet long. This was one that I took into my classroom that I caught when I was teaching 7th grade. And actually, this very snake changed our 7th grade English teacher from being deathly afraid of snakes up to his 32nd year, until I convinced him to hold this beautiful, sleek black racer. And he stood in front of the class with this black racer wrapped around his arms. And he said, "Mr. Trull, I can't believe it." And Mr. Williams, Tony Williams, he said, "I'm not going near your classroom if there's a snake in there." I said, "Come on, Tony, this is a beautiful snake." And before you knew it, he was standing in front of all the kids with this beautiful black racer wrapped around his arm. Well, there's a bird in this picture. It must be mid-April. The osprey have arrived, and virtually every pond on Cape Cod that's got fish in it will show us osprey, a very common and widespread fish-eating bird of prey. I recently learned that in Falmouth alone, there are approximately 135 osprey nests. So you think about all those poles that you see about ospreys, with ospreys nesting on them, and telephone poles and osprey poles and baseball light fixtures. We have absolute, when I moved to Cape Cod in the early 70s, and when I was in my 20s, you couldn't find an osprey. There were none. They were a bird that you only read about. And we did so much to bring this bird back. And of course, they were virtually extinct from northeastern North America because of DDT. DDT runs off of all the crops in the fields and goes into the water system, and the birds catch the fish. And they lay an egg, and the DDT, the pesticide, causes their eggshells to be virtually non-existent. So the ospreys would lay the eggs in the nest, sit on the nest, and break the eggs, and there were no ospreys for 20 plus 30 years. Now we've brought them back so that they're everywhere, and that's good. And we'll compare that to another animal in a minute. And of course, the herring are running. And this is why they're called herring gulls. Actually, the other reason that they might be called herring gulls is for their gray plumage, which in some cases might appear silvery. But the herring gull's species name is argentatus. Larus is the genus name. Most gulls, most of our common gulls are Larus. This is a common seagull, the herring gull, Larus argentatus. And of course, that refers to the silver color. Think of which country has the largest silver mines in the world? Argentina, of course, refers to silver. So they love the river herring and the alewives and all of the different herring runs on the Cape into May. Believe it or not, this is the same scene that I showed you earlier with the blizzard. Snow blowing over those big rocks, low tide, beautiful sky, longer days. It's May, shad bushes blooming. Baltimore Orioles have arrived. The Baltimore Orioles typically arrive on April 29th to May 3rd. Same with my hummingbirds in my yard, that is. The lady's slipper is rare, beautiful orchid found in some places on Cape Cod, but not everywhere. I learned as I wrote the book and the captions and learned about this flower, this orchid, that its correct name is lady's slipper with an apostrophe. A lot of people just say lady slipper, but the true name is lady's slipper. Beautiful orchid. These were in Provincetown in the beech forest, but you can find them in any oak woods if you look carefully and walk slow. A lot of human beings go for walks in the woods, but we are gifted with a beautiful sensory perception of visual acuity and olfactory sense, audio acuity, and so many people are just plugged into earbuds or walking, yelling at their dog, finding every reason in the world not to become immersed in the beauty of the nature that surrounds us here on Cape Cod. And I don't want to say you have to do it, but you do. You have to do it. Take your time, go slow, smell the earth, smell the trees. The trees are always talking. Do you know that birds and trees communicate with each other? HIPVs, herbivore-induced plant volatiles. So we know that vultures have a sense of smell. They depend on their sense of smell. They like nice, rancid, rotten stuff to eat. We also know that oceanic birds have a developed sense of smell because they live in 1 million square miles of flatness. And if there's a dead whale or some squid, they need to be able to smell it 10 miles, 15 miles away and fly to it. But we don't always think of warblers and vireos and robins and blue jays and catbirds and orioles as having a sense of smell. Certainly you can touch baby birds or you can look at a bird's nest and parents are going to come back. Oh, parents will smell you. Well, they won't smell you because their sense of smell is poorly developed. However, trees give off volatiles, gases, vapors when they're in distress. The research is being done intensively in England and Europe, not so much in this country, but if you read about HIPVs, herbivore-induced plant volatiles, you would learn the most amazing thing. That songbirds are able to pick up through their olfactory sense vapors and volatile gases that are being given off by oaks and maples and willows and sassafras when they're being attacked by insects. And I'll give you a perfect example. So when a tree or a plant is being attacked by caterpillars or aphids or beetles or whatever it might be, they release these volatiles into the air that songbirds pick up through their olfactory sense and go and help the tree by eating the insect. And the perfect example is this. We have 2 species of cuckoos on Cape Cod, black-billed cuckoo and the yellow-billed cuckoo. Rarely seen, occasionally heard, But when the gypsy moth caterpillar infestations attack the oaks, you can find cuckoos everywhere. So trees communicate with birds through birds' olfactory sense and the trees giving off volatiles. The Hidden Life of Trees is the book. You ever read it? The Hidden Life of Trees is a book that will absolutely blow your mind. The fact that roots are communicating underground, fungus on the roots. There's so much going on in a woodland that people don't think about. When you think about a living tree and you think about its skin is its bark, and as it gets older, it starts to flake. I mean, it just need to spend some time in the woods. This is starflower and the starflower and Canada Mayflower. Both of these plants cover the ground in May in all of our woodlands, and they're still out now. They're still prolific. Still not a lot of people at the beaches in May, though, because May and June can be very stormy. But the towies are nesting. The warblers are migrating. By the end of May, yes, it's mosquito season, but it's also time for warblers and vireos and all of the southern wintering South American birds that are going to breed in the boreal forests and the Berkshires and White Mountains and Maine, chestnut-sided warbler, black and white warbler earlier. Another kind of oriole. We know about the Baltimore oriole. How many of you have seen an orchard oriole? These are nesting on Cape Cod. They're brick red. They're not the bright orange like Baltimore oriole, much more brick red. Nest high in the trees like the Baltimore orioles. And if you put a little cup of grape jelly outside your deck, you will have both Baltimore and orchard oriole coming into your feeder. It's a beautiful bird, rarely seen, but not uncommon. And of course, birds are nesting in May. May and June are the nesting months. That's the true summer in my world, when all the activity takes place. The least terns are on the beaches, incubating their 2-egg clutches. The damselflies and the dragonflies are emerging. I've been teaching field classes for the Harwich Conservation Trust on the natural history of dragonflies and damselflies. And you all know what dragonflies are, yes? We see them in our yards. We see them on the ponds, on the pond edges. Damselflies are a little bit smaller, hold their wings over their back rather than out to the side. I don't know if I have a dragonfly. I'm just going to go ahead on picture. So this is your typical dragonfly. And we all know dragonflies very well. Hey, what are you doing? This is a crazy machine. I'm sorry. So this dragonfly has a great name. It's called a dot-tailed whiteface, which I couldn't think of a better name. Go back to that damselfly, because what I want to tell you is that this damselfly has just emerged. And if you look above it, you'll see crusty creature. Well, dragonflies and damselflies live the first 2 years of their life underwater in your pond. And they're predators, and they're eating tadpoles and small fish and plankton and copepods. And on any given day in May or June or July, they actually have flight periods. All different species of dragonflies have different flight periods, only live 2 or 3 weeks. They crawl up out of the pond, and what you see above this live damselfly is called an exuvia. It's actually the exoskeleton of this animal. So this is what it looked like underwater, but it wasn't all dry and crusty. It was alive and soft to the touch. And what happened is this damselfly crawled out of this. So the dragonfly nymph crawls out of the pond onto emerging vegetation. Just as you would see it in the water for 2 years, it dries on that emerging vegetation. The back of it cracks open, and out comes an adult dragon or damselfly. It's the metamorphosis of dragonfly. It's only a 3-stage metamorphosis. And that is egg, nymph, and adult. It's really quite interesting. Dragonflies live the same life. They live underwater for 2 years in the bottom of a pond, on all the reeds and grasses in the bottom of a pond. They crawl out of the pond as a little spider-looking creature. That spider-looking creature breaks open, and here comes a beautiful adult dragonfly. And this dot-tailed whiteface will live about 3 weeks, but not before it reproduces, mates with a female, lays eggs. You often see dragonflies tapping the water with their abdomen. They're laying eggs when they do that for the next generation. And of course, the kingbird loves to eat the dragonfly. Well, let me tell you something really crazy about dragonflies, okay? When they mate, the male has claspers, abdomen, and it holds the female by the back of the head. And then the male spins itself up to her reproductive organ, which is here, the base of the thorax. And before the male, that's okay. Before the male injects his sperm into the female, he's got these cool little appendages that allow him to scrape out everybody else's sperm from previous dragonflies that mated with her. Yeah, isn't that wild? The dragonflies are the only creatures on earth that can do that. So he says, yes, I'll mate with you, but in case you've mated with anyone else, I'm going to get rid of that guy. And here I am. And, you know, there are so many amazing things about creatures and organisms that we're familiar with in our lives every day, like the oak trees giving off volatile gases to call the birds in to eat the bugs that are eating them, or like the dragonflies who have the most crazy reproductive system. And yet we love them, we see them every day, we appreciate them, we're amazed by them, but there's just so much that we could learn about them. And of course, this is the eastern kingbird, nests on the edge of the pond, spends his day just swooping down and eating dragonflies and damselflies. They are huge food sources. We spent some time in the North Atlantic over the last few years. I worked with the Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary, putting satellite tags on oceanic birds, shearwaters primarily. And on this one particular day when we were catching shearwaters, it was easy to catch them because they were here when the water was literally alive with fish. You can see that mackerel jumping right out of the water there. The mackerel were feeding on smaller fish called sand eels, which were feeding on a rich bloom of plankton. And of course, you've got humpback whales and shearwaters and gulls all feeding on the same tiny fish called a sand lance or sand eel. And we were trapping the great shearwaters, which are also Antarctic nesters. If you were going out in your boat to catch fish in Nantucket Sound tomorrow or out on Cape Cod Bay and you were going catching stripers, you would see these long-winged brown and white birds just soaring over the water called shearwaters, oceanic birds. They're here on their wintering ground. They breed in a burrow on an island around Antarctica. So while we're celebrating New Year's Day, this bird is incubating an egg in a burrow in a penguin colony in Antarctica. And we wanted to learn about their migration routes. So we were putting satellite tags on their backs. And this was, we were going off Sandwich, we were going off Chatham, just a few miles, and using slick dogfish lures and different things, nice oily stuff to bring these shearwaters in, and then we could catch them with a net, put a satellite tag on their back. And look at this migration route. This is, well, you can't see the top of the slide, but it's after it says southern migration, it says N20, 20 birds. So here are 20 birds that we trapped, obviously, here in Cape Cod, just off Chatham, mostly. 3 or 4 miles offshore, caught them in nets, brought them aboard, stitch the satellite tag onto their back. And look at this migration. These birds will see more places in a year than most of us will ever see in our life. So they're nesting in burrows on islands throughout Great Southern Ocean. They're leaving Cape Cod. They're flying all the way to Spain and Africa, taking a right off the coast of Africa and going over to Argentina, flying south. And we actually had birds reporting from their breeding grounds, but we would lose them because they would be in their burrow incubating their eggs. So we'd lose their signal. And then they'd come back, and we were actually able to determine the length of time they spend, each of the parents spends incubating the egg in a burrow on islands in the Great Southern Ocean. So it's June, it's pine pollen season. It's the height of summer, although this year it certainly wasn't. This June was kind of terrible, kind of nasty. The first 10 days of June is when you see the big snapper crossing the road in your yard, digging up your mulch, laying its eggs. Always the first 10 days of June, when snapping turtles lay their eggs, 90-day incubation period. So if you did have a snapper in your yard or on your road or in your favorite place to walk your dog on the power lines, laying eggs in June, 90 days later in September, you're going to find baby snapping turtles emerging from their eggs. Sometimes the eggs don't hatch because the female buried them too late or too deep, and they will winter over and hatch in April, following year. And when you pick up your next turtle and somebody says, is it a male or a female? And you say, you can't tell. Well, you can. You look at the length of the tail, because male turtles typically have very long tails, and females, because they have to dig a burrow and lay eggs, have very short, stubby tails. So you look at the next turtle you pick up, and if it has a short, stubby tail, you say, oh, look, a nice female box turtle. And your friend says, how'd you know that? And you say, don't you know anything? Pretty much all turtles. Yeah. So the tree swallows are feeding their young. It's late June now. Chicks are just waiting for the parents to come in, begging for food. That was good. Go get me another one. Bluebirds are coming in with grasshoppers to feed their young. This one's got a nice dragonfly for its chicks. Piping plovers have chicks now. These tern chicks have hatched. Early July, common terns have 2 fledglings. They lay a 3-egg clutch. This parent has 2 young. I would guess that the one on the left is fat and happy. And the one on the right is basically saying, why are you standing there? You're my parent. I'm hungry. Go get me a fish. That is what you would refer to as intense food begging by the youngster. And the parent, of course, is standing there going, I've been doing this since 5 o'clock this morning. And the kid's going, I don't care. I'm hungry. Look at Hortense over there. He's fat and happy. I want fish. We see that all the time. Hummingbirds are molting on the mimosa flowers. The monarch caterpillars are eating the milkweed. The monarchs are laying eggs on the milkweed. This is a time when the butterfly weed is in full flower, mid to late July. Look at the tattered wings on this butterfly. It's pretty much lived its life. Beautiful colors are faded. It's already mated. Wings are tattered. I would say it's near the end of its life, late summer. Silver spotted skipper on the mimosa, the tiny little butterfly. It's called a calico pennant, beautiful dragonfly. Its flight period is mid-July to mid-August. You don't see them very much before mid-July, and you don't see them very much after mid-August. Another beautiful dragon called a blue dasher. I was photographing a dragonfly standing on the tip of that twig, and I had a slow shutter speed because the background was water and it was very dark. And as soon as I pushed the button, the dragonfly took off, and I just love the picture. It's what you call a beautiful mistake, but it's actually this species right here. Might even have been the same bug. As soon as I clicked the shutter, off it flew, and I got a blur. Oh yes, great crested flycatchers love to eat dragonflies also. And that's what they feed their young. So how many of you know that the pond near your house has carnivorous plants? A lot of people are unaware that sundew, three species of sundews are extremely common on the Cape. And while you're walking along the edge of your pond, if you look down very carefully while you walk very slowly, just above the water line, you'll see these tiny little plants about as big as a quarter, covered in little sticky balls. Those are sundew. And this moth made the mistake of landing on one. These freshwater vegetation moths are just flying all through the vegetation. They seem to land randomly. This one landed right on a sundew. And those sticky balls of enzymes are going to dissolve this moth's body and use the nutrients to help it grow. This is called a round leaf sundew. There are spatulate-leaf sundews also growing along our shorelines of our ponds all over the entire Cape. And there's also one called a thread-leaf sundew that grows straight up about 6 inches. Carnivorous plants right here below our feet. Plymouth gentian, rare plant, one of the only places on Earth that you find it is Cape Cod, Massachusetts. The frog eggs have hatched. There's a baby Fowler's toad. There's one of my students in one of my pond study classes. Nothing better than seeing a kid waist deep in lily pads with a net. She is now a junior at UMaine Orono. Hannah Rose, 12 years old in this picture. So the terns are flocking up. It's August. They're heading south. They finished nesting. They're on their way to South America from Guyana to Brazil to Argentina. Every one of these birds that you're looking at in this picture, photographed on Nauset, will spend the winter from Guyana to Argentina. Sue Finnegan runs the bird banding station at the Cape Cod Museum of Natural History. She's cut her nets out. She's catching migrants as they fly south. This is a flicker, yellow-shafted flicker that she's got. When I was a little boy driving up Route 495 with my parents, and I would see the Joe Pye weed and the goldenrod, it meant the end of summer. Gold and purple. Beach plums are ripe in fruit. Bayberries and rose hips are all ripe in fruit. I said beach plums, I meant rose hips. September, all the birds are migrating. The tree swallows that are nesting in the boxes or that are nesting in hollow trees all throughout northeastern North America are flying by the tens of thousands along our shoreline, heading to Central America and South America. This is a typical scene in late August and early September. Sandy Neck, you could go to Sandy Neck on any given day in late August and early September and see 20,000 tree swallows, it's huge flocks migrating south. All of the Arctic sandpipers are here, long-billed dowitchers, the red knots, semi-palmated sandpipers, all have nested in the Arctic tundra, and all are heading South America. And that's a ruddy turnstone. And they get their name because they flip over stones and sticks and shells, and this one just happened to dig a hole. Not sure what it's after, but you'll find them on every beach on the Cape. Race Point Light in October. These are terns on their way south. The sandpipers hunkered down in the lee of the rack on the beaches, storing energy. These tiny little birds, as big as chickadees, are going to be in Argentina in 3 months. And then they're going to fly right back to the top of the planet and nest again on the Arctic tundra in the following spring. October and November storms bring all kinds of treasures to the outer beaches. One of the last flowering saltwater flowers. A lot of people don't think of flowers in salt water. These are salt marsh asters, and they flower right up into October and November. You can see that the grasses are turning red and gold. The great egrets are migrating south from their breeding grounds in the north. And while everybody is leaf peeping in New Hampshire and Maine in late October and November, woodlands on the Cape are still green. Our oak trees and sassafras and tupelo, they stay green right through October, when all the other leaves in Massachusetts are being stared at by people who want to see bright colors. The oak trees stay green right up until October and November. Box turtles are getting ready to hibernate. Colorful spring warblers like this redstart lost their black and orange plumage and have molted into their winter plumage. This tiny little bird, not much bigger than a ping pong ball, will spend the winter in South America. There's a winter green and a woolly bear caterpillar, a sure sign of fall. Cranberry harvest in October. We have a lot of active bogs on the Cape. Not compared to some of the other states. The one tree that does change bright colors on the Cape is the tupelo. Black gum is its other name, and they grow throughout the woodlands and the yards here on the Cape. We've gone through the spring and the summer, we're into the fall. Poison ivy is nice and red. The green grass has turned brown. You can still find these orb weaver spider nests by the thousands in the beach grass. Early morning with the dew, probably gone by 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning, broken down by the wind and the leaves of the grass. Cormorants are getting ready to migrate with one great black-backed gull. That's Larus marinus. If there was ever a gull that you would call a sea gull, it's this great black-backed gull, which are common here. They nest on Monomoy National Wildlife Refuge in Chatham. And they are America's largest gull. And again, their name is Larus marinus, the gull of the sea. And this gull that you might see standing on the beach one day could be 300 miles offshore around the Spanish fishing fleets for 2 or 3 weeks. A week later, they are true oceanic gulls. Back whales are migrating south. Whale watch season is over. Gray seals are getting ready to breed. Gray seals breed in winter. In January, they give birth to their pups on Monomoy National Wildlife Refuge, right about January 20th. But these guys were just sitting off the water up at Race Point Beach in Provincetown laughing at me, having a good time. So here's something to think about. How many of you have ever seen gray seals? They're huge, about 800 pounds. You go to Chatham right now, see thousands. But they leave in November, December to breed on the offshore islands, Muskeget, Nantucket, Monomoy. But think about this. When I was here in my early days, I could not only not find an osprey, but there were no gray seals on Cape Cod in the 1970s and 80s. You never saw one. And so we passed the Marine Mammal Protection Act to protect the whales and the sea otters and the polar bears and the seals and the walruses. And we stopped killing them for $5 a nose, which was the bounty on these seals in Massachusetts. And we said, let's preserve them, let's save them, let's bring them back. They're part of our Cape Cod heritage. And now we have thousands of them here. But I don't hear anyone heralding the return of the gray seal. We herald the return of the osprey. We herald the return of the piping plover. We did all we can to save them and bring them back. Well, we did the same thing for these animals. But why does everybody hate them? I can't figure that out. Fishermen hate them. Fishermen blame gray seals because they can't catch any more fish. But the fact is, we caught all the fish. I could go out and boat with my friend Ted Lagenza from Chatham in the early 80s in his 18-foot skiff, 6 miles off Chatham, and fill the skiff with cod till it was ready to sink. He would tell me, I've got boxes of money buried in my backyard. Cod, cod, cod. Now there's no more cod. Well, I wrote this book called The Gray Curtain, the impact of seals, sharks, and commercial fishing along the Northeast coast. And some of the photographs that I have, because I have a lot of friends who are commercial fishermen, and I've spent a lot of time on commercial fishing boats, and the technology that is available now to commercial fishermen, and I'm talking about local day boats. I'm not talking about the big boats with nets that are 100 meters wide and 2 stories high, catching everything. And there's no more cod. They're gone. And the fishermen will always blame the gray seals. Even people who don't know better will agree. I had kids in 7th grade who hated piping plovers and gray seals. They didn't know why they hated them. They hated them because their parents told them to hate them. These fish eat the same fish that humpback whales eat, sand eels. Humpback whale fills its mouth with 300 pounds of fish in one gulp. They catch them individually. Something wrong with that picture. I always bring that point up because I did a lot of research to write my book called The Gray Curtain. And the fishing industry has caught all the fish, which is kind of sad. The good thing about codfish is that they're like starlings. They reproduce rapidly. But even when they close a section, let's close this 5,000 square miles bottom so that the codfish can reproduce. All the fishing boats are scraping the edge. Just in case any of these cod happen to slide out of that protected area. I'm just tired of hearing people blame nature for human misgivings. Yeah, there's a lot of gray seals, but some people want to kill all the gray seals. Imagine that. There's 60,000 gray seals on the Cape. What are you going to do? What are you going to do to cull them? Are you going to kill 10,000? Going to make no difference because they're all coming from Sable Island. There's 250,000 gray seals on Sable Island, which is off the coast of Nova Scotia. If you look at a map of the Maritimes and you look at Nova Scotia, you'll see this little crescent about 80 miles off the coast of Nova Scotia. There's 250,000 of these seals on that island breeding, not to mention Norway and Europe and Baltic Sea. So the gray seals are never going to go away. And the white sharks are never going to. And it's silly for all of the misconceptions to be thrown out there by the media and by talk radio and by people who don't know any better when they really don't understand the intricacies of nature and the populations and the movements. And it's not all about Cape Cod. It's a big area that is all part of Cape Cod. I have a map when I do my program on the Gray Curtain, and it's a map of the North Atlantic from Canada to the equator, maybe not quite the equator. And it's the whole North Atlantic Ocean. And I have a little red square off the coast, eastern coast of the United States. And when you look at that whole map of the Atlantic Ocean and you look at this red square on one section of it, that's 1,000 miles by 1,000 miles. It's 1 million square miles. So there's a lot of water out there. There's a lot of room, a lot of organisms. And there are millions of birds that live offshore. those great shearwaters I showed you earlier. That baby hatches out of the egg in Antarctica, goes into the water, and doesn't touch land again for 6 or 7 years. Spends its entire first 8 years of life at sea. And if you took a boat 1,000 miles east of here right now, there would be millions of birds flying over the North Atlantic. There's a great shearwater in the picture over on the left, and this is a northern gannet over here on the right, both oceanic birds that spend most of their life at sea. This is a good day for the Coast Guard in December to go out and practice on a real stormy, wild day. I was standing on Race Point Beach when I took this picture, and I thought, the Coast Guardsmen and women on this boat are probably having a wonderful time. Well, hey, this is a good day to go out and do some maneuvers. Come on. And this boat was just covered in surf the entire time I watched it. So here we are. We have been pretty much once around the sun. We get into December and the light's different. The days are shorter. Cape Cod Bay and the Brewster Flats. The milkweed's planting itself. The winterberry is being collected for Christmas decorations. I bet you all have your favorite spot to find winterberry every December. Finally starting to get some local color on the trees. Brown. Wild turkeys. Catbird nest. I've noticed that catbirds like to put plastic in their nests. I'm not quite sure why. I don't know if they cover the eggs with plastic when they're off finding food. The bald-faced hornet nests are evident in all of the trees in December. Snow is covering the ground again. I have to tell you one funny story about this picture, and then I think I'll be finished. So this is a camp out on South Beach, heading down towards Chatham. And I took the photograph in a gentle snow, and I thought it was a beautiful photograph, and I would put it in my book. And I had to find out who owned the camp. And it was a fellow that I had met or said hello to, but turned out to be a feisty old codger, because when I finally got his name and sent him an email and said, guess what? I'm writing a beautiful book about Cape Cod and the seasons, and it's going to have photographs that I've made, and I've put your camp in the book, and I thought you might like that. And he went, you can't take a picture of my camp. That's private property. You can't just take a picture of this camp and put it in a book. And I said, no, it's not really private property. And he goes, yes, it is. It's my camp, and I'm not giving you permission to put it in a book. And I said, well, it's a beautiful photograph. And to be honest with you, it's considered scenery. I said, and I can take any picture of any scenery and put it anywhere I want. And I made him a beautiful print, and I matted it for him. Nope, doesn't want it. So the pictures in the book, there's a lot more to this story that I'm not supposed to tell publicly. I told that story when I did a program at Snow Library in Orleans, where a lot of the people know this guy. And I won't repeat. I mean, I could, because there's only 12 of us here, but the people in the audience, I told them the very same story I told you. And one of the ladies in the audience from the back, I don't even know who it was, she shouts out, oh, that guy's a... She throws out an obscenity. And then another lady in the back goes, his wife is even worse. And so by this time, I'm going, this is being recorded. Snow Library records their lifetime learning program. And the people from Orleans that know these people were just going, you did. So I had to call the library and say, the whole piece about the camp on Nelson, you have to take that out, because the people in the back row were not very kind to the guy. And they said, oh, we've already done that, Peter. We've removed it from, it was going, they were making a Zoom, not a Zoom, but some kind of a video that they would show to their members. And my goodness. So the pictures in the book, I still have in my studio a nice matted photograph of this camp that I would give this fella if I ever see him. But it is considered scenery, which virtually means you could stand on Nauset Beach with all of these thousands of people in towels and umbrellas and take a picture with nobody's discernible face in it and publish it as scenery. I learned a lot when I was writing this book about what you can and what you can't publish. But anyway, this is a camp in January, and it has a very funny story that goes with it. And this small merlin, this small falcon is called a merlin, rarely ever seen, winters along our beaches, feeds on that little snow bunting, the dunlin, the sanderling, all the smaller birds that are living on the beaches in the winter. This is the photograph that the publishers chose to put on the cover of the book, which is fine with me because they have a great art department and they seem to know what they're doing. This is a Bonaparte skull that you will only ever see along our beaches in December. Believe it or not, this very individual bird probably nested in a spruce tree in eastern Alaska. So these Bonaparte skulls fly all the way across the North American continent, fly off the east coast of North America, and winter as far southeast as the west coast of Africa. Oceanic birds in the truest sense. So we've got our first ice forming. Temperatures are cold. We're looking for water-stunned turtles that don't have the sense to swim out of Cape Cod Bay around Race Point and south to Florida. They get trapped in the bay, they get washed up on the beach. And because they're ectothermic, they're cold-blooded, they freeze. Some of them freeze to death, some of them are rescued. And believe it or not, they actually fly them to Florida in planes by the hundreds that are rescued along our beaches. Clearly winter, the ocean is fierce, and we have traveled once around the sun.